At the Marine Corporal Taylor Bond, the war has officially claimed 2,000 American lives. As the conflict needs to draw to a close, it's important that we solidify these aims to make sure that those who die do not die in vain. Now, it's for this reason that my partner and I stand firmly resolved that the U.S. federal government should substantially reform its foreign military presence and/or foreign military commitments. Now, first off, we'd like to start by giving some background to current policy in Afghanistan. Background point one is that of withdrawal and transition. And this is explained by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization when they wrote that in 2013 it is expected that all areas of the country will have entered the transition process and the Afghan National Security Forces, known as the ANSF, will assume security lead across the whole country. The completion of this transition process is scheduled for the end of 2014. The second background point is that a funding cut to the Afghan military. To understand this, we have to realize that because the Afghanistan economy is so poor currently, it's necessary for them to have some sort of outside funding for their military. And this comes primarily from the United States. Unfortunately, the current administration's policy is to cut the funding by a precipitous amount. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, in June of last year, they write the administration's plans call for a cut in funding to $4.1 billion after 2014, down from $6 billion this year, unilaterally imposed by Washington despite the apprehensions of our Afghan allies. This proposed cut in funding would necessitate laying off 120,000 soldiers and police. Now, the effects of this gigantic layoff are seen in the harm that of Taliban resurgence. We have two links to this harm. The first subpoint is that of inadequate resources. According to foreign policy analyst Max Boot wrote in February of last year that to cut the already barely adequate number of troops will make it essentially impossible for the Afghan government to control its own territory. There's simply not enough resources to do the job that's necessary. The second subpoint is that of mercenary defections. An article published by the German Marshall Fund in May of last year wrote that the planned cutback may mean putting trained Afghan soldiers into a dim job market where they can easily become vulnerable to recruitment by the Taliban and other criminal networks. Now, this isn't just a theoretical, possible harm. In fact, we've seen this before in the example of the Iraq War, where back in 2004, we actually laid off the entire Iraqi security forces, about the same amount as this potential layoff in the near future. That led to rioting and led to a good number of them going to the insurgents. The generals on the ground agree about the danger of cutting the ANSF, and in fact, Major General John King, the architect of the Iraqi surge, testified before the House Armed Services Committee in June of last year. He said, quote, "A 230,000 strong ANSF would have a disastrous impact upon the morale of the force." And listen to this part. "In and of itself, almost certainly guarantees the return of Taliban domination." So now that we understand that the generals agree, and the awards we presented show that the Taliban is most likely to return if the current cuts go through, let's look at the impacts, the problems that come about. The first is that of human rights violations. The Taliban is notorious for its disrespect of basic freedoms of its citizens. In 1998, the Physicians for Human Rights published a report documenting these abuses. In it they wrote, "The extent to which Taliban regime has threatened the human rights of Afghan women is unparalleled in recent history. Taliban policies of systematic discrimination and the suffering that it causes constitute an affront to the dignity and worth of Afghan women and to humanity as a whole." They go on to say later in the same context, "Thousands of men have been taken prisoner, arbitrarily detained, tortured, and many have been killed or have disappeared. Men are beaten and jailed for crimes such as wearing beards of insufficient length, and are subjected to cruel and degrading conditions in jail and suffer such punishments as amputation and stoning." But our concern isn't just with the terrible human rights violations that would occur to the Afghanistan people. We've got some skin in the game ourselves, as we've seen the second impact that of terrorist safe havens. Our own national security is at risk. The American Enterprise Institute writes, "The likely cost of failure in Afghanistan are the re-establishment of al-Qaeda bases from which more attacks on the US and our allies will be planned and conducted, and the further strengthening of the global jihadist narrative." The third and final impact to this harm of Taliban resurgence is that of a risk of civil war. Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Steve Call wrote that it is inconceivable that the Taliban could provide a regime of stability. About half of Afghanistan's population is non-Pashtun. Most of that population is ardently anti-Taliban. This would likely produce a long-running civil war between the northern Tajik-dominated ethnic militias and the Pashtun-dominated Taliban. Tens of thousands of Afghans would likely perish in this conflict and from the pervasive poverty that it would produce. Many more Afghans would return as refugees to Pakistan, contributing to that country's instability. We would lengthen, prolong, and escalate the civil war if we were to allow these terrible, devastating cuts to go through. So we propose a plan to avert this disaster. It will be enacted by Congress, the President, and any other necessary bodies in the U.S. federal government. The mandate is very simple. The U.S. federal government shall maintain current levels of funding to the ANSF through 2020. Let me read that one more time. The United States federal government will maintain current levels of funding to the ANSF through 2020. That is the date that Major General John Keane advocated as the most likely scenario in which the Taliban would be dispersed by about that time. Our plan will take effect immediately upon the affirmative ballot. We reserve the right to clarify the plan as becomes necessary in future speeches. So before we close, let's look at some solvency evidence. This evidence shows that the ANSF is an effective fighting force. We're not just transitioning over to a force that has no ability whatsoever to fight the Taliban. They're extremely effective. The Pakistan Institute for Peace Studies explained in an article written in July 2012, they said the following: Afghan command security responsibilities has helped reduce violence and civilian casualties, many Afghans report. Insurgent attacks in Afghanistan have decreased 43% in the first quarter of 2012, according to a report by the Afghan NGO Safety Office, an independent monitoring group. So in the areas of Afghanistan where the transition process has already taken place, those are the areas where insurgent attacks are down. So they are a much more effective fighting force, which is actually kind of intuitive. We recognize that people who have an interest themselves, personally, in defending their own land and their own families are more likely to be an effective fighting force against insurgents. So as we return, once again, let's recognize that the only way that we can ensure victory in Afghanistan is to ensure that these cuts are avoided. And that's why we stand affirming the resolution. Thank you very much. I'm moving for cross-examination. Stand right here. Sure.
Are the judges and time ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, let's get started. How are you doing today?
Doing very well. Yourself?
Better than I deserve. Okay, how much are we currently spending in Afghanistan right now?
The current amount, we spend about $100 billion per year sustaining our troops. That particular level is going to change when we withdraw the troops from Afghanistan at the end of 2014.
So your plan is just to go on with Obama's plan of taking the troops out, but just continue funding Afghanistan through 2020, correct?
Through the ANSF, exactly.
Okay.
That's the force that we're
Okay.
funding.
So after 2014, there will be no more deaths of American troops, correct?
Well, yeah.
They won't be there anymore.
There will obviously be the 5,000 or so training troops who will be helping the ANSF, but there will be no combat roles, so the likelihood of them resulting very, very low.
What encouraging progress do we see in Afghanistan's political system? Is there any, or?
As refers to the political system?
Yeah, because if we're funding the AFSS, we have to see something good in their government. So do we see anything good there? Or just funding them?
Our case doesn't really deal with the political system in Afghanistan. We're dealing with trying to avoid the devastating problem of the Taliban, an even worse government coming in and taking over the country. So in terms of effectiveness, I think we do see improvement in the Afghanistan military, as we stated in our solvency evidence. In the areas where we transitioned over to their authority, insurgent attacks are down, deaths are down severely, casualties are down. It has been effective.
Okay. Would you say the main reason for enacting your plan is because the Taliban will rise up again?
That's our part. It's Taliban resurgence.
Okay. So is that the only harm you presented in your 1AC, correct?
That was the one. That was the harm we presented. We gave 3 impacts, 3 reasons why it would be damaging for that.
Okay. And how is the risk of civil war? Would it be the ANFS, I believe, fighting the Taliban? Would that be the civil war?
It's actually the ANSF, Afghan National Security Forces. Not quite. Our argument is that if we allow these devastating cuts to go through, then the Taliban becomes resurgent. The most likely scenario is to have an ethnic conflict, prolonged and escalated. You have the northern areas of Afghanistan where the Tajikis dominate, who are ardently anti-Taliban, versus the southern Pashtun population, which is ardently pro-Taliban. And if you don't have the ANSF to hold the plea.
I lost my question there. No further questions, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning. I think it's still morning. How are you doing?
Good.
Fine, thanks. I'd like to start off by asking if you have the evidence for the
Yeah, I didn't get to read all of it.
All right, then maybe just stay there for you to read.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. May I ask another question during the time? All right, now under your last point you made, you essentially said that the Al-Qaeda return is not very likely. We have the opportunity and the technology necessary to stop them. Now, under that particular point, was it talking about drone strikes, airstrikes, what particular technology?
I believe they were talking about airstrikes specifically.
All right, now do these airstrikes that they were talking about, did they occur in Afghanistan or Pakistan?
Well, they occurred on Taliban, which is the group that we're talking about. It's not really contained within the borders of the country, but we're actually fighting a group called the Taliban, which is not limited to.
Okay, interesting. Now, would you agree that if we lost 120,000 soldiers on our side, it would probably change the calculus?
We also mentioned in our speech that if the Afghan government thinks it's an important thing to keep, then they should fill it in their own budget.
Okay, all right, I see, and we'll definitely respond to that in my partner's next speech. But would you agree that if the cuts do actually occur, it would lead to 120,000 soldiers being laid off?
I am not sure.
All right, does the negative team have an official position on that at this point, or?
Well, even if they were cut off, I think we've provided evidence that states that Taliban isn't going to move outside of their cells that they've already been in. So,
all right,
they're still going to remain.
Okay, interesting. So now, earlier on in your speech, you stated that you stated we're only reducing it by 1/3. Is that correct? Did I hear that correctly?
As long as I understand correctly, that we're reducing it from 6 billion to 4 billion, then
okay.
I believe that would be a 33% cut. Yeah.
That's right. Now, if the United States were to cut its military by 1/3, do you think that would be beneficial to our national defense?
I don't believe that's I don't think that's a good analogy or a hypothetical. Because we're not talking about cutting the United States military, we're talking about cutting our aid to a specific country.
All right, interesting. Now, would you agree that the generals on the ground are probably a good source to recognize whether or not these cuts would be detrimental or beneficial?
I believe we should listen to the generals, the people in the Department of Defense, and our president.
Okay, have you read any evidence from the Department of Defense, from the generals on the ground, saying that these cuts wouldn't be detrimental?
Well, we've read evidence from, I believe, our president, who's the commander-in-chief of all of the troops on the ground where the banners.
Did the evidence ever mention the NSF?
It didn't specifically mention the NSF.
Did it mention Afghanistan at all?
No.
All right, so the president in this particular instance was giving a general outline of general guidelines, is that correct?
Yes, and if you would like more specific evidence, my partner can bring that up in his speech.
Awesome, we will be looking for that. Thank you very much. Starting from the president.